the webinar with Ira Shor about the critical pedagogy and the high schools in the 21st century is conducted with the Futuropolis project implemented by NAZEMI and Institute of Anxiety, thanks to the grant of Ministry of Education, Sport and Youth. So thank you for that. They enabled us to meet. Few words about Ira briefly, because time is precious. Ira, for a long time, was a professor at a public university, City University in New York for 2 years. He is retired now, nevertheless, he is still active and he still works with teachers from many countries like with us. And he, in fact, together with Paulo Freirem, developed a critical
dlouhá léta cestoval a pracoval.
and implemented it to the education. So that's about it. And now I give the floor to Ira. Ira, please, floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to see your faces, and I would like to answer some of the questions sent to me. And the first question I would like to answer that I received, what does the teacher need to know to successfully engage in critical pedagogy in 2021? That is the first question. Here's what I'd like to say. First, we must believe that teaching is a very important and noble activity in society, that we are very important people. Even though we may not receive honors, or we are not paid very well, or our working hours are long, and so on, our work in society is extremely important. We develop the next generation of people in society. So the students who come through our classrooms are going to be the future workers of every society. And without those workers, there can be no production. And there's a crisis in many countries now because the population is declining and the new generation is smaller than the older generation before and may not be able to produce enough to support the retirement of the older workers. So we are the ones who train and develop that new generation of workers. We also are developing citizens that not only do we prepare people for work, but we also prepare them for a life, a civic life in their society. So as they make the crucial transitions from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to adulthood, we also test and ask them to rehearse and to learn about being a civic actor in society, about being someone who tries to take part and in the making of of our society. So in these important tasks of developing the future workforce and developing citizens who take responsibility for how society should be made, what the question we need to ask to begin to approach critical pedagogy is this: what kind of people do we want to develop in our classrooms? And for what kind of world do we want to develop these people? That's really what we are doing. We are involved in taking the population and growing with it, developing with it. And we have to ask ourselves, on what terms or for what ends are we developing all these millions of students who pass through our classrooms? And that question is connected to the larger question is, well, what kind of society do we live in? And what kind of society would we like to live in? And we have to pose that questions to ourselves, so we're able to pose it in the classroom and orient the students to thinking of themselves as actors in history who are growing into more and more responsibility as they age through through the school system. And one of the important principles in critical pedagogy, in undertaking the development of students, is this: can we fit the curriculum to the students instead of fitting the students to the curriculum? That is, what's the orientation of our project? What kind of goal do we have as educators? Do we arrive with a full set curriculum with syllabi and reading lists and tests and so on, and present the education already worked out, and the students must adapt, accommodate, and fit into it? Or do we first study the students, learn as much as possible about them, and then from that understanding of their development, we then design the curriculum that pulls them forward based on where they are now? That would be fitting the curriculum to the students instead of fitting the students to the curriculum. The first one is sometimes thought about as a teacher-centered or an authoritarian way to organize education, because we have a structure into which students must fit or accommodate. The second one is often thought as a democratic way of approaching education, because we ask the professionals who teach in our schools, that's us, the educators, we ask, can you learn who the students are, what they can do, and what their dreams are, and how they work and how they think? And then can we design a curriculum in all subjects that pulls them forward and ask them to take responsibility with us for their learning. Now, to talk more about teaching for critical thinking and for civic action, to develop civic actors in society, one of the central propositions of critical pedagogy is that when we think of what kind of world we want to live in and how that differs from the world that we are born into, then we develop a habit of questioning the status quo. That is one of the foundational orientations of the critical teacher, questioning the status quo, not to be difficult or to be controversial, but rather to look out in the world and say, human beings are capable of marvelous things, and we have such powers. And what does it mean so that we walk out into a world that we're proud to call humane and just and based on equality and so on? So we say we question the status quo for four important values. First, that democracy is the value that brings out the best in human beings. It asks them to think and take part. And without democracy, we cannot have serious critical study of anything or critical learning. We also are very interested in equality, because as long as there are hierarchies which subordinate sections of the population, then we can never claim that we are living in a just society. But society is structured and organized to privilege some over more, and those who are privileged have more opportunities to learn as well as enjoy other products from other experiences in society. So democracy and equality are two of the transcendent goals of a critical pedagogy. And then the third one is ecology, or it's about the environment. Everybody knows that the COP26 just ended in Glasgow, and there were thousands and thousands of people in the streets protesting because after 26 years of meeting, the United Nations group has not been able to stop or reverse global warming. And we are almost certain to pass the 2-degree limit and so on, which is already having devastating effects. I'm not going to spend time talking about that because it's so widely in the news and so on. So we add ecology to democracy and equality because we think there is no life without the world, and that we have tremendous talents to work on the world and with the world, but the system we have is working against the world, and that has to be posed as a problem. And the last value for questioning the status quo is peace. That no one has to itemize how much conflict there is in the world now, and the terrible situations at borders where there's a migration crisis, and the amount of conflict, the states of war that are occurring in the Middle East and in other places, so that we emphasize the peace, because peace is the condition under which human beings thrive. Right now, we are in a terrible confusion, and a lot of it has to do with war making. So those are the overall goals or values that inform us, or what our orientations are when we think that in my classrooms, I want somehow to bring these values into the teaching. So what I want to do next is I want to talk about 5 domains of knowledge into which these orientations of democracy, equality, ecology, and peace, that we bring it in, and how do we gain knowledge in each of these domains that enables us to be a critical teacher. Here is the first domain. The first domain is the domain of the self, or the individual, or what the French philosopher Michel Foucault called care of the self. And so we are teachers, and as individuals, we walk into classrooms and we're officers of the institution who are then expected to initiate development, to start the education process. So we have to study ourselves first to see who are we and what are we bringing to the task. For example, I mentioned before that that questioning the status quo for these values implicitly asks us to be agents for change, or change agents. Now, this is unavoidable to face the question of change, but it's also very difficult because we have no training for it. That is, when we are raised in the home, in our family, we are not raised to think of ourselves as change agents in the family or in school or in society. And when we come to school, there is no course or class in how to change society, or how to change the school, or how to change my education. And then when we go to college or into teacher education programs, there is no training in how to change the schools that we teach for. Now, when I go around speaking in North America, in the United States, I always advise that schools of education must make change agency a central feature of their program for in-service or new teachers. The new teachers arrive at schools and colleges not having any preparation for dealing with the institutional setting and the awesome power of the structure, and that it more or less, any ideals or hopes you bring, you have to adjust to the power of the school, the department, the division, the college, and so on. So we have to, from very early age, we have to practice change agency. Now, I believe we have to practice it in the classroom when kids first come to school. Now, the philosopher and psychologist Bruno Bettelheim, he said the first question that we should pose to students when they enter kindergarten or the first year of school is, why do we require you to go to school? That is, the first question posed to 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds should be the situation that they are in. You are now required to go to school. We are posing it as a question and a problem. Think about it and talk about it, and that's the first project of the kindergarten, is why do we, grown-ups and society, insist you must go to school? Now, you see, he was proposing that, Bruno Bettelheim was proposing that for very young children. So when I say to you, colleges of education and teacher training programs to teach new teachers and teachers in service how to be change agents in their institutions and in society, already I'm talking about people who are 18 to 25 and older. By that time, we are very, very deeply formed human beings who have developed orientations that don't include this idea of being a civic actor who knows how to arrive somewhere, study it, and become an agent of change in that setting. So this must be a continual feature of human development, and it's one of the ones that I emphasize in my critical teaching, and I've written about it in a few books, and I want to say something specifically about that, how it becomes a classroom activity when I go on to the second question about methods. But now I've mentioned about knowledge of the self. So to what extent do we as the individual teacher understand change agency, or how to be a change in the classroom, in the school, and in society? And we have to be very honest with ourselves and figure out what kind of knowledge we need to gain, what kind of experiences we need to have to get better at this, to gain that power. Here's another question we need to pose to ourselves. What is our tolerance for risk? How much risk can we tolerate? Now, there is no standard. There is no, I cannot say to you, every teacher must risk this much. It's impossible. Risk is a very personal, emotional experience. It provokes fear, anxiety, and it stands in the way of being honest and of learning and being a good teacher. If you're full of fear and risk. So in knowledge of the self, the first domain of knowledge, we must ask ourselves, what is my tolerance for risk? How much risk can I tolerate? I can do this and take that risk, but I can't go that far and do that risk. And Paulo Freirem insisted when we did our book together, that we must be very absolutely honest with ourselves so that we don't pretend to be braver than we are. And that leads to all kinds of defensive difficulties and personality problems and so on, and impulsive outbursts because we're straining to act something different. So we need to get clear about what tolerance for risk we have. And associated with that, we need to getting the knowledge of ourselves. How much tolerance do we have for experimenting? Now, experimenting is a lesser form of risk, because if an experiment doesn't work out, you probably won't be fired, you won't lose your reputation, but you'll be confused or embarrassed, or in front of the students, you might feel defensive and so on. So ask yourself, to try something new, to go in a different direction where I don't feel fully competent, to hear something said by the students that I want to draw out further and pursue, but I don't fully understand, but I want to study it. Do I have enough tolerance for experimentalism, for dealing with the lesser known or the unknown, that I can open the classroom syllabus or the lesson to the to student input or student direction? So what's the last one? Oh yes, here's ask ourselves. Knowledge of the self is how much capacity do we have to listen? Teachers are trained to speak, and students are trained to listen. A good student is one who listens and memorizes as much as possible, and a good teacher is someone who talks as much as possible and presents knowledge for the students to absorb. Paulo Freirem called this the banking method of education and pedagogy of the oppressed. So we have, in a sense, to develop our capacity to listen. Can we listen, and then can we know how to draw out from the students more material than they provide on their first sentence or two, so that we have more to listen to. And I think the capacity to listen then brings with it a capacity to speak. But speaking in a dialogue or a discussion form of education is not the same as a lecture. Like right now, I am lecturing. And so I've spent a number of days going over your questions, and I've written notes for each question, and I rewrote my notes 4 times in the last few days. to try to draw out my own thinking about each. And now I'm speaking from these notes in an uninterrupted, extended presentation. That's what a lecture is. Now, Paulo Freirem thought that we needed a dialogue education, a discussion education that posed problems. And he called it a pedagogy of questions against a pedagogy of answers. The teacher is not an answer giver. The teacher is a problem poser. So this presents to the critical teacher a whole different speech task. That is, it's the lecture task is that I spent 4 days studying and preparing my notes, and then I lecture from my notes, okay? Now, I'm not getting any feedback from the audience, so we will have that in the question and answer later, which is good. Teaching is not this type of professional presentation where it's very good and it's okay to call in an expert on something and ask that expert to present his or her knowledge about this or that material or this problem. Paulo Freirem said he did not mean that kind of lecture when he criticized the banking pedagogy. He called this kind of this type of presentation, this type of lecture, he called it a technical session. He gave a different name to it. That is, the people who are the audience have a problem they want to solve or something they want to learn. And they've already recognized their need to learn it. And they say to themselves, well, where do we go to gain this knowledge? Because the more knowledge we have about this, the better we will be at it. So let's ask, what books do we have to read? What the articles, what people are the experts in the field, and how do we read them? And they say, okay, let's call this expert in to talk about this. And you sent me the questions. So you already organized the agenda of my talk by sending me the questions. Now, that's a paradigm for critical pedagogy, because I'm not answering questions nobody asked. Now, that's what an academic lecture is. The academic lecture is the lecturer conceptualizing the knowledge and then making a long presentation. I want to know what does the audience need to know about this question? And then they inform me of the technical needs and so on. Then I have to organize my presentation. I call this the democratic discipline of the teacher. This is the democratic discipline of the teacher. It's a dialogic format. That is, I don't come here with a preset lecture about what to tell you. I ask you to tell me what should we talk about? What matters to you? And then that disciplines my presentation by your offerings. Now that's the model of the dialogic method, and it's the model of the problem posing teacher. So I don't lecture in any of my classes unless at a certain point there's a accumulation of questions that have come up in the dialogue that I can make a presentation on based on what I've heard from the students and what I have encountered in their way of understanding what we're studying and so on. So they have authorized me to lecture. Now, I want to say that again, because critical pedagogy changes the nature of authority in the classroom, the power relations of the classroom. That is, what we are trying to do is to authorize the students to raise questions and pose problems and make statements and comments about subject matters, and that the teacher now participates in how they have presented their understandings of whatever we are studying, and I join the dialogue. And the more I am democratically disciplined by the dialogic process, the more I gain the right to speak in my own voice. Now, here's what this means. What this means is that when I am lecturing, I am speaking in what we call in English the declarative mode. I'm making declarations. I'm making statements. Statements are sentences that end in periods. And I speak extended paragraphs, all that end in periods, because they are declarative sentences. In the critical classroom, my my habit of speaking is declarative. Just a second. I'm trying to find the word. It's yeah. It's a question that I'm posing questions. So the sentences end in question marks. So when the students hear my voice, the declarative sentence ends in a down sound of the period, the end of the statement. And then I've made my statement. But when they hear the question, it ends with my voice high up. My voice is high. That is the signal in human speech for the other person, the person you are addressing, to respond, that the floor is now open to them, that the speaker has finished posing a problem or a question for general discussion. So I must develop I must study my own habits of speaking, and am I speaking in the declarative mode of the teacher-centered lecture, or am I speaking in the questioning mode that poses a problem? Now, I have no right to be a teacher if I do not have a lot to teach. So I must know a lot about something, or else do not be a teacher. Become something else. Be a carpenter, be a medical doctor, a nurse, whatever. But if you are a teacher, you must have very in-depth knowledge about some subject matters. Okay. Now, how do I integrate my developed subject matter expertise into a dialogue that's student-based or student-centered, because they are not experts in the subject. They come to school because the teachers have been hired as the experts. So typically they expect we will start lecturing nonstop about our expert knowledge and so on. And that is the most passive way to learn, except if the audience itself, like you, organize a technical session to which you bring the expert and discipline her or him with your questions in advance, to which he or she must address. Okay, now, the democratic discipline of a dialogue enables me to elevate the profile of my commentary the more successful and the longer it goes on. That is, if the dialogic process, problem posing and drawing out student commentary, my asking questions and commenting, responding to student comments and so on, if that goes on and students become situated in the dialogue, then I gain the right to say more every lesson, every class meeting. I gain the right because I have displayed and carried out my democratic commitment to a dialogue. That's a dialogue is mutual, that we are here meeting because of some subject matter and how we think about it and what we need to learn about it. And so what happens is, during the semester, I start out saying as little as possible, and that my profile, my speech profile, elevates elevates in terms of me providing more of what I know as the dialogic process brings more students into the dialogue, into the discussion. Okay, now that's so. What I've mentioned this because I have to study my own speech. I have to gain the knowledge of how I speak in classrooms, and whether I'm speaking in the traditional way of the teacher-centered presentation, or the dialogic manner of posing problems so that the students say as much as possible for as long as possible. Here's the second domain of knowledge. I have to study my colleagues. In whatever school or college I teach at, I must study my colleagues, the other people, the other professionals, my peers. I must learn as soon as I can who is who. So I must find out if I'm interested in being a critical teacher and to teach in the way I just described, to question the status quo. Do I have any allies on the teaching staff? Am I alone? And that's the worst news of all, is to be alone. Paulo Freirem always said, he always repeated an African proverb. He said, it's impossible to confront the lion alone. It's impossible to confront the lion alone. You must bring all the hunters of the village with you, or else you will get eaten for lunch by the lion. So the first thing I must do is get to know my colleagues and especially trying to see, is anybody an ally to work on critical teaching? Can we do some collaboration together? Can we experiment? Can we co-teach in a class? Can we set up a study group of teachers like us who want to take responsibility for our own development? So in this study group of teachers, we report to each other what we do in the classroom, and we are brutally honest. This worked and this did not work. This happened in the classroom, I don't know why. And then in group, we start to unravel and understand what the situation is. And we share, we have like 4 or 5 teachers working on the same problem, and we improve each other's teaching practice. The Japanese practice this in their school system. It's called lesson study among the Japanese, and the Australians do it too. When I arrived as a very, very young professor 50 years ago, I immediately organized a study group for a new writing program we had. And that study group met every week for 5 years. And we did all kinds of projects together, but we also improved each other's classroom practice. We co-taught, and then we also published papers together in the most important journal for writing studies. Without them, I couldn't develop the way I did. That I needed them to reflect with, and we were about 8 or 10 of us. We also then published a booklet of practices for the other teachers in the department. So as in a sense, we were trying to make our experimentalism colonize or hegemonize the rest of the department, which was traditional. But we had to first do things that were worthy of spreading. So any teacher who experiments alone is very vulnerable and is working at the highest risk. And that is something that is just not, you cannot live with. You will be isolated, and you will be mistreated and probably fired because you're so out of step and so on. But if there's a group of people working together, then a group protects each individual in the group. And no school can get rid of 6 or 8 or 10 people at once, because they won't be able to replace it. All right, that's knowledge I have to gain about my colleagues when I come to school and want to be a change agent. Also, I need to ask if there's a teachers union and what effect they have and how they operate. Here's the third domain of knowledge. That is, I have to then study the students, and I have to study them as an anthropologist and a sociologist. I must try to do an ethnography of the students for whom I teach. I must learn about their class level, their the life of gender in this community, that how do men and women relate, how are women treated. I must learn about race and skin color, and what ethnic differences and how that plays out here. I must also pay careful attention to the age of my students, so that whatever I design or ask is age appropriate. And then I must learn about their family lives. What kind of housing do they live in? What's their diet? How do they get food, and what kind of food is very popular here? What's the situation with wardrobes and clothing? And for example, my wife used to teach at a inner city high school, and students, when New York gets very cold in winter, probably you get very cold in winter also. Some students don't have winter coats. And so when September and October become November and December, they come to school with the same light jacket. So the teachers then raise money to buy winter coats for the students who don't have winter clothing. So this is called creating the conditions for pedagogy. That is, I'm talking to you about how to teach, and I'm saying, okay, let's pose a problem, and let's do a lot of writing about the problem, and do low stakes writing as much as possible about all the things and so on. So I'm already in the classroom talking to you about pedagogy. But if something is interfering with the beginning of the class or the opportunity to teach experimentally or differently, then we have to create the conditions for pedagogy outside. For example, I've had students who come to class without food. They don't eat. So they haven't eaten all day. So late afternoon, we have a class, they fall asleep on the seat. So I say, first, what, am I boring or what? Am I just not worth listening? Then I began to think, this student looks very bad. So I said, did you eat today? And she said, no. So I gave her $3 and I said, go to the cafeteria and eat and come back after you've eaten. So and then another student couldn't get to class because she had no money for gasoline. So anyhow, in the early days, I had to make small loans to the students to create the conditions for pedagogy. This only raises the question of inequality and hierarchy, where most of the students in America are working class. Although we have 14 million students in higher education, most of them are working class. And so they have very serious economic problems. Later on, I began to stop using textbooks because they couldn't afford the textbooks. And so I had to learn how to teach without textbooks. So I wrote my own materials and Xeroxed them and handed it out. And I also went around collecting copies of textbooks that the book salesman dropped off in the department, and I would hand them out for free to the students and so on. But if I ignore the conditions for critical pedagogy, who am I? I'm fooling myself into thinking I have a free path to go ahead. So food, then clothing, and then what kind of recreation do the students get involved in? Is drug taking a very big problem here? Do most of them smoke? How many of them have to work for money outside of school because their families need income and so on? And what's especially important as students get younger is that it's a grave mistake to keep students sitting at their seats the whole day. This is called in English in America, seat work. That at their seats, students are supposed to sit at their seats, very well behaved, and listen and do all the work at their seats. The younger the student, the more activity they need, the more physical activity. There must be breaks. And that we must do the physical activity at the start of the day. When students come in very, very energetic and so on and so on, we must go for hikes and in playgrounds and this and that, and work with toys in the classroom, do presentations and so on. And then as the day wears on and their energy level declines, then they're more happy to be seated and so on. So that's one thing I ask about them, is their recreation and so on. Then I ask about their dialect. How do they speak? What dialect do they speak? Most working class students in America do not speak standard English, the standard dialect. They speak varieties of other dialects, depending on their ethnicity and depending on the region that they come from. I arrived at school speaking an urban dialect. I did not speak standard English. I learned it in school. I maintained my urban accent in English. I sound like an urban person because of the way I pronounce words, but I've learned the syntax and lexicon, the word choice, the vocabulary of the elite. So my sentence structure and my vocabulary are upper class or more elite, but my intonation, my pronunciation is working class or urban and so on. So we must learn, how do the students speak? What kind of dialect do they bring to class? And we must never judge that dialect to be inferior. That the way they speak it's a language. It's a way of communicating that gets a lot done. And we must allow them to bring their home language into the classroom. At the same time, I'm trying to introduce them to conceptual ways of thinking and conceptual habits of mind, critical habits of mind. A lot of the vocabulary associated with that way of speaking is not colloquial or low dialect. So when I'm about to use a word that I know has never appeared in their world, in their speech world, I say it out loud and I say, I'm going to ask you to theorize now, to develop a theory. And they don't use the word theory in their speech. So I go to the board and I write the word on the board in large letters, theorizing. And then I say out loud, here's what it sounds when I am theorizing. And I say 1 or 2 sentences out loud in a theorizing discourse. And I say, now here's what it sounds like when I am in a practical discourse that I'm not theorizing. And I say 1 or 2 sentences out loud. And I want them to feel at home, confident, and capable of now, how to put it exactly, transforming or further developing their own command of speech. That they can add these things in the overall process of a democratic or dialogic or a critical classroom. We can borrow these features that enable deeper discussion or deeper inquiry without abandoning or subordinating the students for whom this material is simply not designed. So I call this, I have a name in one of my books, I gave a name to this process where I am trying to internalize the students' dialect and the way they speak and learn their words and their speech patterns. And I'm hoping that they internalize my academic speech patterns and habits of speaking. And then somewhere, when we do that, we are overcoming what Paulo Freirem called the teacher-student contradiction. And I named this overcoming, I named it the third idiom, or a third way of speaking, a third way of using language. There's teacher talk for all of us trained in college and the academy on how we talk about things. Then there's everyday talk, the colloquial talk of the dialects that students bring. Whole categories are missing from their colloquial speech, and whole categories of reference are missing from my academic speech. The place where critical teaching happens is this meeting place where we begin to notice and address each other's way of speaking. And when the dialogue process works best, we are inventing a third idiom in the classroom. So I must pay close attention to how they use language and allow that to operate in the classroom. All right, that's the third. Here's the fourth knowledge that I think is the foundation for a teacher who wants to practice critical pedagogy, and that's a knowledge about the school or the institution that we're working in. Okay, how would you judge the authority in the school, the administration? Would you judge it as more autocratic or more tolerant or more democratic? Is it more traditional or is it more experimental? How do we get a profile of the authority that rules or runs the school in which we teach? I'm subject to this authority. So Paulo Freirem called this a limit situation. It's a situation of limiting what we can do because the authority who's watching us and judging us and evaluating us and deciding whether to keep us or not, that it has a power. And so we have to carefully observe, how does the authority, the administration in this place use its power? The other thing we have to learn is the authority mostly bureaucratic or is it mostly pedagogical? That is, do they use a lot of like business language to run the administration of the school, or are they always putting educational goals and educational culture into the decisions and policies that they ask us to follow? So we have to listen carefully to where the authority speaks to learn the profile, how important educational discourse, educational policy is in their decision making. And then we have to ask practical questions like, in the classroom, how much testing am I required to do? Am I required to use these? Are these textbooks required? Is there a mandated syllabus I must follow, or can I design my own? Do I have enough resources? What kind of resources are available in the school, or are we short some resources? For example, when I arrived as a young teacher 50 years ago with my writing classes, I asked them to write TV scripts about their everyday life. And then we had a TV studio, and we would go to this TV studio and we would produce, they would produce small plays about their own lives, about family life, this or that. And then in the second year, the budget was cut for the TV studio. And I was told there's no more TV studio. So I had spent a year or two, the students loved it because it made them feel like TV personalities and celebrities, the lights, the cameras, So I had to then give it up. I wasn't able to use this method because the material resource was taken away. So I had to move on to something else. And here's the fifth domain of knowledge that I would study if I was a teacher trying to do critical pedagogy. I have to study the location, the community in which the school is set. And I have to ask, the politics, the ideology of communities are not the same in society. Some are more to the left, some are more to the right, some are more religious, some are more less religious. So I have to get familiar with what kind of community the students come from. I have to know the community outside their homes. And I also have to get to know in this regard the political climate in society at large. When I started teaching 50 years ago, the political climate in the Western world, in America, Canada, and in Western Europe, was liberal and experimental. And as Michel Foucault said, it was from 1960 to 1975, you could criticize everything. As he put it, everything was criticizable. And it was remarkable. And that's the time in which I came of age and in which he wrote his first books and so on. So it was a very liberal, progressive, open period where the authorities, the power, as Paulo Freirem calls it, the power now in power, was on the defensive, in retreat, and the progressive forces from the bottom up, the democratic forces of society, Black folks and women folks and working people and so on, from the bottom up were on the rise. So it was a great time to be a young teacher, and it made it a lot easier. But then, as the movie says, the empire struck back, and so suddenly the dark forces arrived, and we had a 5-year war in my university that the wrong side won, and a lot of my colleagues were fired, and all sorts of very bad requirements were enforced upon us, and so on. So we have to know the political climate in society, because it teaches us how far we can go, and in terms of limit situations. In a progressive period or a democratic time and space, there's more you can do in pushing against the limits than in a reactionary. Right now, we are in a reactionary time. Neo-Nazism is on the rise here in America, as well as in Europe, especially Hungary, Poland, Belarus, and other places. So the initiative now is on the right, and the liberal forces are in retreat or on the defensive, and so on. So this is a very difficult time for teachers, because critical teaching proposes democracy and thrives in democracy, as do human beings. Because in democracy, human beings breathe deep and feel invited to be as creative and as participatory as they can. So this is a time when many folks in school and in the workforce feel vulnerable and isolated, because the standard of living is declining, and it's harder people have to work more jobs, and so on. So we must be aware of the political climate locally in the society. Now, how much, is that an hour? How much time, how much did I?
7 minutes left.
10 minutes left?
7.
10 max? 10 maximum?
It's up to you.
Okay. All right. And I know this always happens when I give a talk, that there's never enough time. I'm happy to come back if you think it's useful. You can also send me emails with questions and thoughts. Eva has my email. I'll be happy to get questions. People send them from everywhere. I answer them and so on. So we'll get as far as we can in this short time. Okay, so the second question was, whose methods can a critical teacher use to work with dynamics in the classroom? First, to answer this question, I made a list of the people who have most influenced me, the scholars and the educators and the authors whose books have been most influential to me. I'm going to mention their names. There's no time to explain how each worked, but I want to mention their names because all in the last 50 years, and especially at the beginning, I was reading constantly to try to teach myself, to gain the knowledge. So it would be the American philosopher John Dewey, very important. The Russian cognitive psychologist Lev Vygotsky, Maria Montessori, which I'm sure everyone has heard. There's also a very experimental educator named A.S. Neal, who ran a school called Summerhill in England for a few decades. Then there's a very, very important educator in Italy named Don Lorenzo Milani, who wrote a book called Schoolboys of Barbiana. And he was a priest, a liberal priest, who was banished to the wilderness by the Catholic Church in Italy, to one of the poorest, most remote places, where he decided to start a school for the poor children. And his students learned to read and write, and then they wrote a book called Letter to a Teacher, where they were talking back to teachers about what school should be. And it's an event in the history of education for the illiterate and the impoverished of interior Italy to write. So it's called Schoolboys of Barbiani. And a lot has been written. His name is Don Lorenzo Milani, M-I-L-A-N-I. And then there's this New Zealand teacher who was wonderful with young students named Sylvia Ashton Warner. And she worked with Maori native children and English children in New Zealand. And then, of course, Paulo Freirem, and then a lot of educators in Australia have done very important work about student-centered teaching. Anyhow, those are the people I read. And so, and then I read some Americans like Herbert Cole and others who were working in the American context. Anyhow, these were the people from whom I borrowed ideas for a student-centered theory and practice. That a theory and practice based in the needs of the students. As I said in the beginning, how do we adjust curriculum to meet the students' needs instead of asking the students to adjust to our curriculum? Those are two wholly different undertakings. And those are the people I read, and can we fit the curriculum to the student and so on. All right, now this, in terms of the methods, that this, as I've been saying before, that it's that participation, it must be very participatory. That is, on the first day of class, I don't say anything when students come into the classroom. I hand out a sign-in sheet, a sheet that asks for certain information about their name and address and so on, what they're studying in school and so on. And then it has about 10 questions under it. And the last question is, what advice would you give to the teacher to make your education work very well here? So before I say anything to them, I'm asking them on this sheet to write advice to me, the teacher. Some of them don't write anything because they've never heard such a question. The question has never been asked of them by a teacher. They don't know what to say. They also fear my authority, that if they say the wrong thing, I'm going to like judge them failing and so on. They don't know who they are dealing with yet. So it's very intimidating to about a third of the students, and they write nothing to a very little. Some write a sentence or two. Some write very useful commentaries to me. For example, one wrote down, "Don't kill us with your voice. Don't kill us with your voice." And so I'm trying to understand this from the student's point of view. So you see, I'm studying the students. As my first responsibility as a critical teacher, I must study the students. So if there's 30 or 35 students in a class, maybe 10 or 12 will actually put material down that really educates me. This is one of them. Don't kill us with your voice. So I try to remember, and it's like when I walk the halls and listen, teachers are speaking very loudly. And they think if they speak louder, the students will understand better, that the students actually suffer a deafness of some kind, and that their job is to develop a strong voice. So, so I had to promise not to kill them with my voice. So you see, my habit is to say as little as possible in the classroom for as long as possible, while yet providing activities and problems so that students read, write, and discuss as much as possible for as long as possible. I'm trying to reverse the typical classroom experience. Typically, you come into a new class and the teacher makes a presentation about what we're going to study, when things are due, what we're going to read, how class will run, and so on. We have an expression in English called reading the riot act. I don't know if there's a similar expression in Czech, but reading the riot act, like the British came to the rabble, in the colony who were protesting, and they read the riot act. They say, if you don't shut up and leave and go home, we're going to shoot you. So that's like a metaphor. Reading the riot act is that you've got to do this because I say so. Okay, you're laying down the law, the authority. Okay, so I don't read the riot act, but I present this sign-in sheet, and then I present some opening problems that are existential, experiential. For example, I asked the class to write, I put 4 things on the board. I say a handful of almonds, the nuts called almonds. I say a hamburger that you can buy in a store, a 10-minute shower you take at night, and the full load of laundry you do in a washing machine. And I put these 4 on the board. And then I say to them, they're all familiar to the students. So I begin with experiential material that's legible to them. It's very important, that word legible and concrete. And then I say, which of these 4 activities in your life uses the most water? And then I say, think it over and then write down which of the 4 you will choose. All right, take a moment, everybody who's participating, which of those 4 activities do you think uses the most water? The hamburger you eat, a handful of almond nuts you eat, a washing machine load, or a 10-minute shower you take tonight. Just take 20 seconds and make your decision. All right. So the students also, I tell them each take out a pencil, paper, and they write their choice. Okay. They've made their choice. Now, the very important thing, this is a very important cognitive step. After you've posed a problem that's familiar, but also not worked out completely, which has some unknowns in it, and you pose it to the students and you ask them to make a choice, you must ask them next, why did you explain how you know? See, they must now become cognitive about their own cognition. They say, for some reason, intuition or experience or something, they read something, they have a reason they put down one of the 4. So now they must explain why they made that choice. How do they know? So then they have to write a few sentences down. Now this has a name we use in English studies here. It's called low stakes writing. That is, this is not a test that I will grade. This is not a term paper. It is not a research project. This is a lot of writing happens in class, but it happens around small activities, and we call it low stakes because the consequences are not huge. Okay. Then after they write their explanation, I say, okay, form groups of 3 and read your explanations to each other, because I want them immediately not to listen to me, but now to start getting used to discussion with each other and comparing intelligence and the way that they understand. So they read to each other and in groups of 3 or 4. Then you see, I'm not making any commentaries. I'm posing activities and questions. Then I say to them, did anybody in your group come up with the same answer as you? Just as a simple way of organizing a group. So some people in this group over here on that corner say, yes, 3 of us thought it was the shower. Okay, they have their answer. Okay, and then I turn to the rest of the class and I say, how many other people picked the shower? And a few hands come up. because I want them to feel that they already have allies in class. That it's very, very risky to speak in public in schools and colleges and classrooms, because you're exposing yourself to ridicule. You don't speak standard English. You may say the wrong thing. You may get the question wrong and so on. So I have to calm their fears about speaking in public. Okay. So I say, anybody else? And so 5 hands go up over there. So this group says, oh, so we got allies. Other people agree with us. So I say, okay, so look, how about 2 of you reading to us why you chose the shower, okay? Then I'll go on. Did anybody choose the hamburger? And we'll do the same thing. Did anybody choose the almonds? Did anybody, what's the 4th one? Forget. The shower, the hamburger, the laundry. Anyone choose the laundry? And then I bring in a text, and I bring in a printed text, which is an article about this very thing, about water use, okay? Now, this text I bring in, I call this the official text, because I got it out there in society, in the world, published in some place by an authority. Whatever they say and do and write, I call that the unofficial text, because no one has authorized them, no one is publishing them, and so on. So it's very important that students produce the unofficial text before we bring in the official text. The official text will silence their way of thinking and speaking and writing, because it will set the standard for what this means and how to think about it. So it's very important to pose the problem and then generate unofficial text, and then to spend as much time on the unofficial text, then to bring in the official text, because look, hey, we are teachers, we have knowledge, we know which of these 4 items uses the most water. And this is a scientific question. So this article I bring in is about that, it's research. So do you want me to tell you which of the items uses most, or do you want to do your own research? Can I have is anybody really curious, dying of curiosity? All right, I will tell you, because there's an ocean between us. So here's what I will tell you. The item among the 4 between doing a laundry, a hamburger, almonds, and what's the 4th one? Almonds, hamburger, almonds.
Shower.
What's that?
Shower.
Shower, right. That it's the hamburger. A single hamburger uses more water than a full load of laundry. One hamburger, to produce one hamburger, uses more water than a full load of laundry, than a 10-minute shower. And almonds come very close. The Chinese are buying almonds all around the world because it's a very popular dish in China. So anyhow, so then I bring in, so then because it's been legible and meaningful, and it's already been generated in their own writing and reading and speaking and so on, they now get an official text in standard usage. And they see how research sounds, and then we compare it, and then we compare it to their own choices. And so, and then we compare the official and the unofficial. So what I've tried to summarize here is like the idea of method. That if I tell you that we want to adjust the curriculum to the students rather than adjusting the students to the curriculum, that's a theory. So every theory must now have a practice. Practice means I have to have a way of doing it in the classroom. So what I've just run through is a simple example of how I might do that. Okay, so listen, I think my 10 minutes extra is up, right? Okay, so
Yes.
I want to thank you for being so patient and listening to me for so long. I'm very, very grateful for your attention. I'd be very happy to hear any thoughts or questions people have.
Tak je prostor pro otázky. Ptejte se klidně česky, nebo jsme se taky
Now there
domluvili.
is room for questions, so feel free to ask in Czech or in English. So you can now ask Ira. So feel free to ask a question if you wish.
Tak kdo má otázku, jestli můžete zvednout elektronickou.
So I would like to ask you to raise the e-hand. If you can't find it, just raise your hand and we can ask questions for you.
So we are maybe silent by authority already, sure.
good question. I will use my position. Well, I was thinking during your lecture, like we in Czech Republic, we have got like this specific problem that we don't trust each other, and especially the authorities and but each other, and that's really creating like atmosphere of like toxic individualism, let's say. Do you have got any tips or tools how to like empower like the collective spirit and maybe the trust?
To get the students to trust, the class to trust?
Maybe, and maybe how to
Teachers?
build trust among colleagues.
So that is my responsibility as the teacher.
To je moje zodpovědnost.
So when I said before,
Takže to, co jsem řekl předtím,
the students reported their answers,
studenti
and then I turned to the
nahlásili
rest of the
své
class and say,
odpovědi.
does anybody
A
agree
já
with
jsem
them?
se potom obrátil na třídu a ptal jsem se, souhlasíte s tím někdo?
3 or 4 students always
3
raise
nebo
their hand.
4 studenti.
So I see that as a way to encourage the original students, the 3 students, you're smart, you're on the right track, you're doing good work, people agree with you. So that this process of like posing a problem and asking the students to think about it and write an answer, and then collaborate in small peer groups about the answer, and then can reconvene the whole class, hear some, and then find who agrees. But here's the second thing. Some students disagree. The most important thing, 2 things. First, I must encourage all the students to feel confident that they're smart. Second thing, I must encourage students to debate with each other. We call this in English crosstalk. That is, discussion in many classrooms is not really discussion. It's a form of press conference where an individual student asks a question to the individual teacher, and then the teacher speaks to that individual student and answers her or him. That's not discussion. That's a press conference for the teacher. So discussion is that people are addressing each other across the classroom without going through the teacher in a way that is respectful and orderly. So if someone says something, excuse me, if someone reads something, I always ask, does anyone want to hear more from this student, or does anyone have a question from this student? Or does anyone agree with this student who feels the same way whenever I pose a problem? First thing I want to do is get the students debating among themselves. And that's a sign. The more students debate among themselves, the more it's a sign that they're accepting the dialogic process and the participatory process of the classroom. The more they address all their talk and questions to me, that's a sign that we're still stuck in the authority, teacher-centered classroom where only what the teacher says counts and so on. So that's one way I would try to do it. Does that help? Does that make sense to you?
Díky. Pak tam měla Jana v chatu. Ano, Janí, polož prosím otázku takhle klidně napřímo.
Yeah. In the list it was question number 15. I would like to know how it is with biology and chemistry of natural scientists and critical pedagogy, because there are more facts than problems. For me, the structure of cell or photosynthesis is just, it's not a problem. It's
sure.
just necessary to know.
Can I please ask, where do you teach?
Secondary school, or 8 years Yes, secondary school.
8th grade, and biology or chemistry? Or
Biology,
okay.
biology and sports. But
Does the school hand you a syllabus and you must cover all these topics? Does the school require you to cover all these topics or subjects in the class? Does it say to you, the first month you must study photosynthesis?
well, there are some curriculum. There is some kind of plan which I can during the year, which I can or I have to explain it.
Yes. You're required to teach these subjects?
Sorry?
You're required to teach, for example, the cell, the atom, the molecule. Okay. So,
excuse me, just a technical. Jani, když tak si zapni to tlumočení do češtiny, klidně i pro ten dialog. To bude...
Já to najdu.
Dole je ikonka země koule.
Nevidím.
Když najedeš myší, tak ve spodní
Better to interpret it.
Nevím.
okay. Yes?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, suppose if I say we adjust the curriculum to the student and not the student to the curriculum, and then we have subject matters, a specific subject matter called biology, then there is what we call a large body of knowledge called biology. There's also a body of knowledge called chemistry. There's a body of knowledge called literature and history. So these name bodies of knowledge. So the people that the educators I mentioned before, the names of the educators, they believe that we should teach that we should teach experience first and the concept second. So that this is John Dewey, and he says John Dewey, the American philosopher, was famous for saying an ounce of experience. He said, an ounce of experience is worth more than a ton of theory. Because when we start with an experience, we can learn everything we need to know. What I wanted to talk about in terms of teaching science critically, I wrote down, there's not enough time, but I wrote down, instead of teaching atoms or molecules, like having a section called photosynthesis or having a unit called atoms and molecules, we instead have a section called food. What? Is our friend saying something? Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yes, they hear you. They hear you.
You hear me? Okay. All right. So we have food, and what I was thinking about is that in we study the biochemistry of food, we might start, say, with bread, and ask about the biochemistry of bread. The biochemistry of bread involves yeast. Honestly, I do not know what yeast is, but I think I would like to know. And yeast, when teaching about yeast, what does bread look like with yeast or without yeast? And then what is yeast? What is the chemical and biological, the chemical composition and biological activity of yeast? And that through yeast, actually, we start with bread. So I would come to class with about 10 loaves of bread, each one different. And then I would show the bread and I say, does anybody eat this? Of course, everybody eats bread. Okay. And then we'll say, can anyone explain to me how bread is made? And so what are we going to study? We're going to study the science of bread. Bread making is a science. And so I would ask, okay, I would say, look, it says, I bring in something to read. We must have yeast. And what does yeast do? Then I would bring in the biology and the chemistry of yeast. Now that's one component that we could study. And what happens if you don't include yeast in bread? I would bring in bread made without yeast and show the outcome and so on. Now, the second thing I would do is I would say, what is gluten? Gluten. What is gluten? Some breads have no gluten, some have a lot of gluten. Some people are made sick by gluten. So I don't even know what gluten is, but I know I avoid it. I've read things that say don't eat gluten and so on. So I don't eat bread with gluten. But I would like, if I was a science teacher, I would want to study the biochemistry of gluten and why some scientists insist that it makes some people sick. So I would start with experience, like what everything we do is more or less is science. Every activity. In addition, if we approach this experientially, we can also approach it in an interdisciplinary way, like this. Who made the first bread? When did bread appear in human society? Where and who made it? So now we're dealing with anthropology, archaeology, we're dealing with history. Then I would say this: in what parts of the country in what parts of the Czech Republic do people eat this kind of bread and not that kind of bread? So now we would be doing an ethnography and sociology of bread, that in different places in the nation, different kinds of bread are popular. And what grains go into bread, and where, now we do geography. Where is the grain grown? And now we study, oh, well, this bread is made from corn, this bread is made from wheat, this is oat bread, and we say, where are these grown in the Czech Republic? Where does this come from? And so on. Then I would say, okay, when corn and wheat and oats and rye bread are grown over there, how does the rye get to the table as bread? Now I would want to do the science of processing. How, at what time is rye harvested? When it's harvested, how is it then processed into grain? How is the grain then? What is the machinery involved? That's what I would want to know. Yes.
I think this is the challenge for the biology teachers, because this is so much about bread, and then how to fit it in the curricula if it's like obligatory. So
yes, you could take something from the everyday life of the students and then do the biochemistry of that. For example, water.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to say one more thing about water, that I've urged a lot of teachers to study the water that comes out of the fountains in schools and do the biochemistry of water and compare it to the water that comes out of the faucets at home. And then to ask the question, how does the water get to this faucet? And when I asked the question before, how much water is used for any of these activities, water has so many ways that we could go. We know now that there is like a water crisis in my country. There is a terrible drought in California where 40% of our food is grown on the West Coast where there's a drought and so on. So water is like a crisis now in some societies. Anyhow, then I would study that in the science class.
Thank you. Petře?
Nevím, jestli jsem byl já nebo Dalibor, tak já položím...
Dalibora jsem neviděla, tak jestli dovolíš, dám přednost. Ne? Nehlásil se, tak...
Oh, can I say one more thing, please? I made notes. There was not enough time, but I made notes to speak about science. And for example, bread is called a carbohydrate. And it's one of the starches. The other starches that are common are like rice, potatoes, noodles. So I would want to know, what does it mean to be a carbohydrate? And this is now atoms and molecules and cells, and we can draw we can draw different kinds of carbohydrates, the structure of carbohydrates. And I studied carbohydrates in organic chemistry. It was very interesting that some carbohydrates we eat, and some are fuels that we burn, and so on and so on. So that what I would look for is that we are living science, and that science is constantly speaking to us. Thank you. Someone else have a question?
Yes, Peter and then Dalibor.
Okay.
Díky moc, Iro. Měl bych na tebe otázku. Paulo Freirem vlastně často hovoří o transformativní akci, že vlastně ta kritická pedagogika má vést žáky k tomu zmocnění, v podstatě uvědomění si svojí role jako občana svobodného, a pak to vlastně má vést, ta pedagogická aktivita, nějaké autentické transformativní akci, která změní situaci vlastně žáků. Tak jsem se tě chtěl zeptat, jakou máš ty zkušenost za ta léta, nebo co by si doporučil, jak můžeme v tradičních školách vlastně vést žáky k té transformativní akci ve svém okolí a podobně. Díky moc.
Okay. First, we have to ask, which students are we working with, and what are the conditions of their everyday life, and what are the conditions of schooling. So I'll give you an example of what I could do in a classroom. In typical classrooms, the teacher is the only authority. I am an officer of the institution, and I am hired because I gained credentials in a college. I come to the class, and then I'm in charge of the class. So this model of what we call in English unilateral authority, which is part of banking pedagogy or monologue, that the knowledge comes only. What? I'm sorry, what is that?
That was technical problem. Sorry,
Somebody unmuted. It's
okay.
off already. Yeah.
Continue. Okay. All right. So I want to democratize. I want to transform power relations in the classroom, the students' experience of authority. Okay, are we following so far? So I now am a teacher, and I'm authorized. I am the sole authority. I am authorized to run the classroom, and not the students. Okay, so this is a model of how society operates. That is, when you get a job, there's unilateral authority of the boss or the company. That work is not democratic. That all the work sites we go to are run from the top down, and at the bottom, if there is a union, you can negotiate this and that, and that's very important. But the authority of law and the state is invested in the supervisors and the managers and the owners. So in a sense, year by year in schools and colleges, we get each new generation used to unilateral, undemocratic authority, taking orders, and that somebody is in charge and you are not. Okay. So I think that this is the long-term contribution of schooling to the weakness of democracy in society, that democracy is not practiced, but it is praised. It is a verbal or rhetorical praise. We love democracy. Democracy is wonderful, but we don't practice it. So I say to myself, let's transform the classroom so that the classroom in some way practices democracy. Okay. So in the first day of class, I ask the students on the sign-in sheet to nominate topics they want to read about, write about, and discuss. So I want to now compose the syllabus from their suggestions and what questions do you have about writing that you want this class to work on. So I ask their input from the start with that in that small way. Then I've also done an experiment with what's called classroom rules, the rules of the classroom. So I ask them to write down, for example, do they think people should be allowed to eat in the classroom? And so we write down a provision and we discuss it and debate it. And then in this typical, what comes out is this, that people can eat in class as long as they take out all the mess. They don't leave a mess behind. And so that's typically a rule. But I've done that more elaborately with what's called a grading contract that I hand out in the early in the semester. I hand out the teacher's proposed grading plan, the teacher's proposal for A grade, B grade, and C grade. And then on the sheet, I list for an A grade, I list all the things I propose a student should do. And I do that for a B grade, and then I do it for a C grade. And then I have some classroom rules at the bottom I suggest, like, for example, no insulting, no yelling at people, different things about grading, but the A, B, and C is there. I hand out the sheet and I read it out loud, item by item, to the students. And I say to them, I am trying an experiment in my classes. I'm trying to negotiate the grading plan with the students and to have the students write the grade plan with the teacher. And then I ask, has anybody done this with any other class or any other teacher? Nobody has. So do you understand the problem? First of all, as a teacher, I never did it in any classroom with any teacher. And I have to teach it to myself as a teacher leading this practice. So I have to learn over a period of years how to do it well. But the students have never seen such a thing, so they don't know how to take part in it. And they're still not, many are still not clear if I'm a mean, nasty person who they should fear for failing the class. So I read it out loud, item by item, and so on and so on. And then I say, does anybody have any questions about these items? And then I wait for students to ask questions. Then I say, does anyone have any suggestions for items that should be changed, removed, or items that should be added to the plans? And typically what happens is that the first week, the students don't feel competent to engage in that discussion. So I say, well, I want everybody to take home the plans and come back next week I'm going to start class with a discussion about any refinements or changes you want to make in the plans for each grade. So they go home, then they come back in a week and I start class. And slowly, it takes some of the bravest students say, we should be allowed more absences, or we should be allowed more latenesses, or we should be, the papers are too long. They should finally, someone takes one or two brave students to say out loud something. And, so it's very important is that when the student says it out loud, we should not have to write so many papers. It's very important that I maintain what's called a blank affect. That is, I should not show any emotion on my face because they are carefully reading my face for my disapproval. So I have to just take it as a matter of fact and say out loud, okay. And then I repeat what they said to the whole class. And I said to the person, can you please now explain why you think that's a good idea? Okay, why you want that? And that person goes on and they take some time explaining. And then I'll say, does anybody agree with this plan, this change from that person? And I very patiently go around looking to see. Sometimes someone will say that I agree. And I say why and because and so on. Okay, sometimes somebody will disagree. And so we begin to have a small, I call this a constitutional assembly. That is now we are we're constituting ourselves. We're constituting our own governance, our way of governing ourselves in the classroom. That's what that sheet is. It explains how are we going to relate to each other and work with each other. So it's very difficult to get the Constitutional Assembly underway because no one has ever done this. So do you understand it's a transformative moment in the experience of the students as subjects in a classroom? They usually experience themselves as objects who are told what things mean and what to do. So now I am trying to transform the students into subjects who say out loud, I want this, or this is what this is, or this means this, and then engage with others in a debate about the accuracy and the validity and the usefulness of that idea. So we debated for a while, and then I said, well, let's take a vote. So I asked, how many people think that we should change this to that? And I look at the hands, and if if the vote is a majority, I say, okay, I'm going to change it to this. And that when we go through the whole contract that way. And after we've done the Constitutional Assembly, and then I announce, you have three options now. You can sign the original contract that I proposed if you don't like the new contract that we negotiated, or you can sign the new contract that we just made together, or you can throw both of those out the window and write your own contract and come to my office and negotiate a contract privately with me that you think is best for you. Do you understand what it means? Adjust the curriculum to the student. Don't adjust the student to the curriculum. So each of those theories, those theoretical principles have to have a practice all along the way. This is just how I use it at this practice, but it has to be used every time we read a book, every time we have a discussion, every time we write something in class and so on. We have to remember what it means to adjust the curriculum to the student. And that, so most of the students in class sign the negotiated contract. A few don't sign anything because they don't understand what it is and they don't want to have anything to do with me. As far as they're concerned, I should jump out the window and leave them alone. So with them, I don't do anything because, hey, I'm not the colonel. I'm not in charge, you know, I'm just a teacher. So I just, you know, carry them along, a few students. Some negotiate a private contract of their own with me and they write their own. And I say, that's good. I don't like them. And they fulfill that contract. Every month or so, I write a letter to each student, how they're maintaining their contract. What are they keeping up with their grade that they contracted for? So that's one transformational practice.
There is an additional question from Jana. If you do this with each new group.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jak staří jsou ti jeho studenti?
How old are the students?
Yeah.
The students during the day classes, they are 17 to 19.
Yeah.
And
but
in
our
the
students are 11. Our
Yeah,
students are 11, 12, 13.
yeah.
14 as maximally.
Yeah, right.
Which we work in this project, you know, and then we are responsible to not to the students, but to the parents.
Yeah.
Parents want us to do something.
Yeah, this is an option. It's not.
Yeah, it's like one kind of practice. It's been tried at some other schools and colleges in America, but teachers are generally not willing to undertake. Teachers, this is one of the risks that, whatever. But the man I mentioned before, A.S. Neil, N-E-I-L-L, who wrote the famous book Summerhill, he included in his community meetings, he included students of all ages to make the rules for the community. Mm-hmm. And that I don't teach 12-year-olds, but I wish I did, because I'd like to see what is possible at that age. And for any of these practices, do you understand that we are more or less inventing each along the way and learning how to do it and what is possible and what is not possible. So in some classes, this negotiation is not possible. the students are too afraid. Also, they work too many jobs outside school and don't have time to learn. They don't have time to learn a new practice, which requires more attention. Traditional schooling is a routine. It's a habit that students learn. Yes.
Excuse me. I would like to make space. There are two more questions.
Okay, it's okay.
We have just 20 minutes. So
okay,
if we can leave
sure.
this thread. Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you.
Peter, are you okay with that? Yeah. So then it's Dalibor and Michal. So
yes.
Dalibor.
Okay, thanks. Hello, and thanks for the great lecture. Ira, may I have a question about grading? Because we all work in the context of a primary school, and we are supposed to grade the students' individual effort. And unfortunately, we are supposed to grade them for providing answers rather than asking questions. So my question is that consistent with critical pedagogy, and how to grade? Because in a primary school, we can't just grade essays or opinion pieces. Thank you.
Yes. I think testing, there's quantitative and qualitative education. Quantitative education tests students, and they're graded on their answers and how close their answers are to the accurate one. I think that testing is not good for student development, that we should involve students in a different kind of learning process. The learning process should be qualitative like this, that we should build something. Like, let's say we are in the United States, we're studying Native Americans, the native population. In the school assembly hall, we should build an Indian village. We should study books to see what was an Indian village like in this area when the white people first arrived from Europe. And then we should build an Indian village, and then have all the classes come and all the parents come and see. This would be called an exhibition. We should exhibit what we learned. And then everyone should take part in it. And then we should get feedback from the parents. So what did you think of what your children did? We should also have a lot of magazine writing and journalism, that the students should interview each other and interview the principal, the head of the school, and publish that. And then we should go on field trips. Like, I think it would be very good to visit a bakery and talk to the baker and see what kind of flour and we have to interview the baker. What kind of flour does the baker use to make this bread, that bread, and that bread? And what is, which flour does he or she use to make pastry? So what's the difference between bread flour and pastry flour? And then who are the employees? And ask the baker, why did you become a baker? And write his life story. And how did you learn how to become a baker? And what's the hardest thing to do when you are a baker? And what do you like most about being a baker? Who are your customers? Do you have any really difficult customers? What do they do? So what we would do is write basically the life story of the baker. But we would also then learn about a job in society, how much the help earns, and how does this get that's called a field trip. Now we can go to all kinds of places. We can go to automobile stations and speak to auto mechanics and ask them what breaks down most often in the cars you fix, and why is that, and which car do you think is the best built car that you work on, and so on. All the time we're gaining knowledge about flour, and where does he buy his flour from, and about like the carburetor and the way the fuel. And ask the auto mechanic, what will you do when all vehicles are electric? Is that going to be a bad time for you, or do you think it's going to be good? And then we can go home and we can study what's the difference between the internal combustion engine and an electric vehicle. How does the electric vehicle move the car? Why? How does it do things differently? Now, this is science. and we would learn about lithium-ion batteries. And it would be, but it could start with a field trip. It would be very good if we can locate somebody in the community with an electric vehicle and go interview them and see how it works. Then we would come back. Yeah.
So this is an example how to gather knowledge then through tests. And can you connect it to the Dalibor's question, like about the grading? So if this is, right. If you want to,
Okay, so now we call this, the grading could be portfolio grading. That is, we'll say, when we do the project, we want you will, in your portfolio, your folder, you will put an explanation. What is the difference? Explain how an electric vehicle works and how that's different from a regular vehicle. Second question, research and find out who is manufacturing electric vehicles now and how many are now on the roads compared to the other vehicles. How much electricity does an electric, we would ask a serious question and you would put it into the portfolio, but it wouldn't be a test, it would be a research that the students would be presented with. The Australians do this, Australian educators in lower grades do this a lot. They have a very strange name for the research files of materials, knowledge. They call it jackdaws. It must mean something to Australia, but I don't know what it means, but they're called jackdaws. And so you assemble a jackdaw file on electric vehicles that students research. And then what they have to do is, after we visit, and they have to write in advance questions you want to ask the mechanic, questions you want to ask the owner of the electric vehicle, questions you want to ask the baker, questions that you want to ask the baker's employees, and so on. And then you might want to question one or two customers, but they have to prepare in advance written materials so that they're being cognitive in preparation for this outside activity, the field trip. Then they bring all the materials back. Then with all the answers they get, they have to then write a composition. Why did Joseph become a baker? Did he have other opportunities? Did he change careers? Was he a Navy man who became a baker, and so on? Did he learn at home? And so they would write the biography of the baker, the biography of the auto mechanic, and something that would involve a lot of writing and thinking and use of language. But then they put that in their portfolio. So their portfolio must have these minimums. We list at the beginning, you must have these minimums. And then you hand the portfolio to your teacher. And what we organize here is that there's a group of teachers outside the class who independently evaluate all the portfolios in addition to the teacher. So it's not just the teacher trying to give good grades to make sure everybody looks good, but the teachers outside also have to look at the portfolios to see if they're competent and they're well done. So it would not be testing as we understand testing. It would not be come in Friday and answer these 40 questions. We don't want short answer questions because we want projects that make you think and organize knowledge. Does that make a difference? Yeah, that makes sense?
Yeah, in a way, thank you.
It's much easier to give tests on Friday with 40 questions, fill in the blanks. It's quicker. Also, it's a mass practice because you can do 30 students at a time, take them home, and you can feed them into a machine which grades them. And so it's bureaucratically convenient. It's also convenient in terms of labor policy. If we wanted you to be a teacher who used the project method, we'd have to cut your class size in half. We would have to hire twice as many teachers because you cannot do this with 30 or 40 students in class. You can do it with 15 and do a good job, but that would mean that education would have to be better funded than it is. And the only reform that in the United States we can't win is smaller class size.
Thank you.
Yes, more.
These are the limits.
What?
These are the limits you were mentioning before, no?
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's a limit situation, right? Thank you.
So Michal has another question.
I have like two parts of the question about the topics. When you were mentioning that you are adjusting the curriculum to the topics of the students, and you ask them what topics, what if there is a wide variety of topics? How would you choose which topics to cover or not? And the second part of the question, more difficult, what about very controversial topics, very opposing views, how to solve that if the students want to discuss or want to learn about, you know that it's going to be very controversial, very difficult, and almost, I don't know, hard to reach agreement or hard to reach some common ground. How to tackle such topics.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. So one of the foundational questions of critical pedagogy is, where does subject matter come from and what do we do with it? That more or less summarizes the task of being a teacher. Teachers have a subject matter and then they decide, how do we teach this? And so that's a very important foundational question that every teacher should ask in preparing herself. Where does subject matter come from and what do we do with it? Now, if subject matter is mandated, like you must cover these topics and you must use this textbook, that's a limit situation. That's very restrictive. And so it's more strenuous, more difficult to become student-centered when the entire curriculum is organized in advance and required. Okay, here's what I do. On that first day sign-in sheet, one of the questions asks students, what topics do you want to read about, write about, and discuss in class this term? So then they all write. Some write nothing because they've never been asked their opinion about this. They don't know how to begin to answer. I would say about out of 25 students, I would say 5 to 8 don't write anything, but 15 or 20 will give me an answer. So then I take all the answers, all the topics they suggest, and I type them out on a sheet when I get home on a computer, and I type out all the topics. Now, suppose they suggest 20 topics. Some of those topics will show up on more than one student's paper. So next to each topic, I list them, how many people suggested this topic. So for example, getting rich, 3 people wanted to do about that, like dealing with your parents or something, you know. So I let them know that certain topics repeated, and I tell them how many. Sometimes topics 8 people or 9 people, and so they see it. So I bring that sheet back, and it turns into a ballot. I hand it out the next class, and I say, here are all the topics that you folks said you want to read about, write about, and discuss. So what I want you to do is circle the top 5, the 5 that matter to you most. And then each of them looks at them and they do 5. And then I collect them. Then I take it back, and that helps a lot to sort out and reduce the number of topics, because then the next time I bring the ballot back, some topics have been chosen 14 times, some topics only once. The only person. So it begins to sort out, and a class majority begins to emerge. What I call a critical mass evolves around what topic should we study. And then I'll say, okay, I'll find out which 3 are the most popular, which 3 are the most chosen. And then I'll check in with the students that they agree these are the 3 that got the most votes. And they'll say yes. I say, okay, now I'm going to go and organize a unit around each topic. And I'll ask them at each unit to bring in reading materials that they want to add to the class. So the students must contribute the reading materials in addition to me collecting my own reading materials. So for example, now that's how I narrowed down 30 students, nominating topics. So second thing is, what if controversial? Okay. Okay. They come up all the time. So for example, police brutality against Black people comes up always, because somebody, not everybody, but somebody is always wants to learn. Then also what comes up is gay marriage, gay people marrying people. Then what else comes up that's controversial? Oh yeah, the war in Afghanistan. The war, whatever, all through my teaching, whatever war, wherever we invaded, it always shows up. That war shows up. Then what else shows up? Oh yeah, abortion. abortion rights, abortion rights. And then what else shows up? Other topics, but like you would imagine, controversial topics. So I include them. First of all, I am not suggesting them, and I am not speaking in favor of them to signal the class, you must choose these topics because I like them. I'm blank affect. I treat all the topics the same, and they all show up on the ballot. And then I see how many people want to study abortion. How many people want to study a game? Oh, another thing shows up is illegal immigrants, shows up a lot. And so if they win the vote from the students, then they are part of the syllabus. And I don't rule them out, because like I say, I have not chosen them, and I don't push them, but they want them. Now, I have that freedom because I teach first-year college students. So they're considered adults, and all these controversial topics can be put in front of them, and they're not children anymore. So the children, our societies consider children must be protected from all these topics. So if I chose those topics in lower grades, I expect that I would be under more criticism from the dean, from the principal, from some parents, and so on. If some students come up and they say, "Look, I can't write about abortion, or I can't write about homosexuality," I will say, "Okay, you don't have to. What do you want to write about?" And I'll say, "You pick your topic, and you have to hand in the same composition, same length, and so on. But you can pick your own topic. I don't force anybody to write it. If they approach me, I'll let them off." Now, I have colleagues who teach in lower grades who bring up these questions about racism and inequality and violence against women. They do bring them up in their classes, and they are veteran teachers, and some are new teachers. And this is what I said before: you must know the political climate in your school and community, and you must have allies who will agree with you and defend you, so that you're not isolated and alone. So if you're thinking of doing something controversial, I would first learn, has this been done here before, and what has happened? And who are the people who are likely to oppose me? And who are the people I could turn to for support? Would anybody want to team teach this class with me? Now, I taught when I first got to college 50 years ago, I had a gay friend, a homosexual friend who was in the department, and he and I co-taught a remedial writing class in male liberation, because at that time, women's liberation was much in the news, and we wanted to experiment with the topic of male liberation. And so he joined me, and we raised questions of homosexuality. We actually made a play in the TV studio about homosexuality and so on. And there were all men, 10 or 12 men, and they loved it. There were a couple of Marines, soldiers, who opposed everything homosexual you could name and let everybody know about it. But I was very young. It was a very experimental time in America, and so I did it. But I would want to know. I would want to think. I advise all teachers to consider to gain knowledge about your setting when you want to experiment. So you walk into it with what we say in English, with your eyes wide open. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Máš nějakou doplňující, Michale?
My question was rather, how would you solve the situation when it ends up in the endless discussion, yes, no, that the views are so opposing in the class that it comes to no end?
Oh, the students. Oh, yeah. Look, I need a critical mass of students in class to accept the invitation to critical pedagogy. I cannot force them to do it, okay? So if there is not a critical mass of support, and there's a critical mass strongly opposed, I have to become the traditional teacher they demand of me. students can have the right to force me to become a traditional teacher. And I don't have the right to insist that they behave this way. They can't misbehave and disrupt the class, but they can disapprove of this kind of syllabus. And so there are classes that I would say every semester I taught 3 classes, and I would say every semester at least one class refused to accept it. Typically one class would be more enthusiastic and work on it, and yeah, one class would be there.
I think
Yes.
Michael means if in the class, so if the class is divided through in the topic. So if there are like 2 sides.
I see opposite, yeah.
Yeah, 2 opposite sides. So how to end it somehow? Like,
yeah, they don't have to agree. I think that's the experience of democracy. Democracy is a
orientation in time. So it's 8.
Yeah, democracy is a rhetoric for the non-violent solution of conflict. That's what democracy is. Democracy is a rhetorical means for the non-violent solution of conflict. That's how I understand democracy. So the students don't have to agree. And if we were like, but when we're dealing with a policy, like what should we do for an A grade? What is an A grade? We have to agree. So I'm instructed how to judge, how to evaluate the A grade, and they also know what to do. So, but even then I tell the students, if you don't like the contract that we negotiated as a class, you can throw it out and write your own with me privately. And that's the limit of how much I can require a mandate in this process, because this is not social policy making. We are not in a government. We're not in the Congress or the Parliament, where we have to come to a conclusion about doing this in society. So I push it as far as I can, but the students don't have to accept. If more teachers did that, more students would accept it. The fact that they know so little about this democratic process and have been in school 12 years already and have never heard of it, never practiced it, makes them uncomfortable and hostile and worried about it. So if schooling was democratic, then by the time students got to college or by the time they got to work, they would expect classrooms and workplaces to be democratic. So that's the transformation that's involved here.